Hello, fellow travelers. Thank you for joining me again. This is episode 24 of The Unbroken Ground. My name is Paul, and I'm excited for you to join me. We're just going to continue to talk a little bit about Christianity and following Jesus, and just kind of see where we land today. No real specific plan for the month of June. So very excited just to kind of talk through some ideas and think out loud about some stuff, and hopefully again challenge you to be a much stronger follower of Christ, to think through theology and Christianity in a deeper way, not just in a surface level. So yeah, that is what we're gonna do. Again, just kind of talking through some various subjects about following Jesus, and working through just a couple of different Bible stories, and yeah, that's it. If you have questions or comments, always you can find me on Facebook at the Facebook / The Unbroken Ground, or email theunbrokenground@gmail.com, or again on Instagram. So yeah, we're gonna dive in. I think the thing that I want to talk to you or about in this podcast, just kind of think out loud a little bit, is about the idea of sin, and in a sense of the sins that the church, the common popular Christianity culture seems to deal with differently than other types of sin. And I think that part of that's just culture. And I think that we need to have a deeper understanding of what it is we are called to be. I think Jesus calls us to be the light of the world, to be on the city on the hill, to be the salt that seasons and saves and preserves the world. That we are called to be in the kingdom of God. That as we do that, as we follow Jesus into his kingdom, as we bring about his kingdom rule, that we'll see the world shaped by God. I think that we struggle because we as Christians, we don't know how to handle sin, because there's this idea that if you get saved, that you shouldn't sin any longer, and which is true. Like you shouldn't. That should be the goal, is to not sin. But for those people who take seriously their walk with Jesus, if they were to take a look at their lives, if they were to study their hearts, they would be like, well, but I still sin. Even Paul, in his later walk, would say that even as he got closer to Jesus, like as he got closer to who God wanted him to be, he said, God just continues to reveal how sinful his heart, his life truly is. And so even to the point where he would say a good saying is that he is the king of all sinners, that he is the chief of all sinners. And I think some of that too, he's pointing back to the fact that he persecuted the church, that he persecuted the followers of Christ. And as he did that, I think that he probably still felt some residual guilt, although that he no longer was under that guilt, that he had been forgiven, and he would write about that. But I think that that some of that still weighs, his history of who he was still weighed on him. So there is that sense of like, if you're going to follow Christ, then you are going to walk by the Spirit. And as you walk by the Spirit, as Galatians say, then you no longer follow the flesh. But again, if you are any kind of serious believer, you will you can find places in your life where you just don't hit the mark, you don't meet the mark of what God expects. And again, sin can be what you do. Sin can be what you do, and it also can be the sin of omission. It can be what you don't do. Like God is saying, "Hey, you should do this," and yet you don't. God's saying you should do this, God says you shouldn't do this, and you do. Like those are both of those are sins, and I think that growing up historically, I definitely saw a shift in how we treated different types of sin. And even if you just look at like the idea of the relationships in America circling based around like marriage, in my lifetime, I have seen the church go from hardline. If you got divorced, you disqualified yourself from service. You can't be a pastor, to a place where you don't even really hear many sermons on divorce, to where we don't even talk about divorce as like, hey, this is a devastating thing. Like Jesus even talked about it. He's like, you can't separate what God has put together. And we know that there are some real world complications. There's real world wounds that happen because of things like divorce. And so we've kind of, but it's become so common in our culture that you just don't, you don't hear people, you don't hear sermons about it. There's so many people, and then what happens, or why some of this happens, is because there's such a multifaceted understanding of relationships, of connections, of why divorce happens, that suddenly it's like, well, yeah, you can't just preach from a pulpit like, oh, all divorced people are bad. If you've listened to the interviews on this podcast, you know that I interviewed my friend Chris, who's been divorced because his wife basically cheated on him and left him. So he's divorced. It was like, oh, we'll make an exception for him. But okay, yeah. But it's hard to do that if all you're doing is proclaiming one thing from, say, a pulpit, from a sermon. And I think that we have to figure out how to be more nuanced, better at thinking and talking about what it means to follow Jesus, and how sin fits into that. And then also we have to be more aware that the Holy Spirit is actually is the one that convicts and the one that changes people. And so we have to be able to say and know and to explain the truth, but also in a way that is loving. And so we don't want to water down what the truth is, but we also want to balance that with a relationship, because I think truth without relationship is not love. And so if all you want to do is give truth, but there's no relationship with that, it doesn't cost you anything. Like, is justice really justice if it doesn't cost you anything? It's a lyric from a song I listen to, but it makes me think about this. And I think it comes back to like this idea that things like divorce, which have now become just kind of accepted, I think it's crazy. I've heard more situations in the last 5 years. I've heard more situations where one person in the relationship, this marriage relationship, sometimes they're kids, sometimes there's not, just decides that they're like, yeah, I just don't want to be married anymore. And so they're like, I've fallen out of love. I thought I wanted to be married, but I don't. And and it's just heartbreaking, because usually it's not both people. Like, I know of very, very specific situations where one person was like, I'm out, and the other person's like, but I don't want to be. But they can't, you can't force somebody to stay. You can't force someone to, you can't coerce somebody to love you. And it's just heartbreaking. And so I think as we think about that, like it's just this idea that if we are going to be if we're going to be the people of truth, which we should be, we have to balance that out with love, which means that we have to have a relationship. So if you come along somebody and you're like, well, divorce is wrong. Jesus says so in the New Testament. If you can find it, that he says you shouldn't divorce, even though there is an allowance in the Mosaic law to do so. He said, don't let. So if you come along somebody and you're like, divorce is wrong, then you have to be ready to walk with them in their shoes. You have to be ready to understand who they are, where they're coming from, and that just changes how you interact with them. And I think that, like, a lot of this this comes down to is that we really focus on sins that are not usually found, especially as I was growing up, we focused on sins that were not really found in our culture. So for example, like homosexuality, like we were like, oh, it's so bad. It's evil, and God hates homosexuals. And that was the kind of language that we had. And it led to some very bad things that people, like, when you're like, oh, God hates them, I can kill them and it's okay. Or you had things like the Westboro Baptist Church, where they at funerals would parade and be like, yeah. And some of that is, and again, some of that is because it wasn't in our culture where people were out and about dealing with that. That was the other people. And especially if you think back, and I grew up in the 80s and 90s, but as you think back in the 80s, that was kind of a culture that was around a lot of drugs. It was based around a lot of poor life decisions and those type of things. And so it wasn't really, the Southern white collar, blue collar Christians that were dealing with us. And so it became easy to make that a target. And so I just began to think about, like, what if we, like, what would happen if Jesus came back and he spent some time with you? Or what if you got to interview Jesus, and he was back and he was like, all right, Jesus, dude, give it to me straight. How do I inherit eternal life? You probably heard this. I've done a podcast adjacent to that. I'm not going in the same direction, but a rich young ruler did ask him that. And Jesus understood that ruler, his heart was so for money that he needed to rid himself of that influence so that he could fully commit to following Christ. And the rich young man said, no, I'm not going to do that. He didn't say it out loud, but he went away. And I just think, like, if we started to look at the culture of America, and if as Christians we said, what if God was actually calling us to live in opposite of the capitalistic society that we live in, where everything finds its worth in a monetary value? What if we instead said, what's the goal of life? Because if you look at the what the goal of life is, if you were to take just an kind of a cross section and said, "What's the goal of life?" Most people in America, I think, are going to say, "Well, I want to make enough money to be happy. Like I want to be happy." And I want to be happy. And part of that then means that they make enough money that they are happy. And all of us have different levels of happiness and the things that make us happy. But I think like having enough money to have the house that you want, to have the number of kids that you want, to have the health care that you want, to have the cars, that the number, all of those things, to be able to pay for college, to not be in debt. Like, those are the things that we, like if you were to say, what's a successful American? Those are the things that we would point to. And if you said, what's a successful Christian American, I think you might get that they add on that, well, they also show up at church, or they're real good people, or they vote Republican, or they're nice. And I just in my mind, I just began to think, what if Jesus was to come to us here in America, in our capitalistic society, and go, you guys should just sell everything and just come follow me. Or what if he said, hey, that church in Acts, the book of Acts, Acts 4, where there were people in need, and so somebody who had more would just go sell some of their property, and they would just bring it to the church and not even get a tax receipt. They would just bring it to the church and just be like, hey, it's yours, it's not mine. What if you lived like that? And I think that just the fact that already I can hear the arguments of like, well, God's not a God of poverty. God doesn't want us to be poor. God doesn't want us to all to be destitute and wandering around and be homeless, and he's not calling us to that. And I'm like, yeah, he might be. Like, are we close to that? Like if you think about the churches, the pastors, the people that attend, the amount of money that they have. Like, what if God's called and was like, hey, I want you to give it away. I want you to spend it not on yourself, but I want you to spend it on other people. Give it away and come follow me. What would we say? What would you say? If you found the teacher, Jesus, the rabbi, who had the words of life, and you said, Jesus, what must I do to have eternal life? And he said, oh, just give it away. Give it all away and come follow me. What would you do? And I think it just reveals to us then what our society worships. Because I think if you ask that question, I think you'll get a lot of pushback. I think you will get people that are going to just be like, well, God's blessings are on me. He doesn't want me to be poor. He wants me like he wants me successful. He wants me to have influence. He wants me to have power. And it might be true. I can't speak for everybody, and I'm not even trying to say that we ought to be all living at the poverty level. But I do think that as a Christian culture on a whole, I do think we ought to consider what it is that Jesus would look at in our culture, our lives, our churches, and he would say, hey, you need to think about this. You need to do this different. And I think that we would find a very different response to the teachings of Jesus if it really, really cost us something. And that's why I don't want to I don't even in any way want to disparage the young ruler, because he's not any different than you or me. He was very rich. He had lots of stuff. he had happiness. He had comfort. Oh man, we are a culture that desires comfort. We want the AC to be at the right amount. We want the pillows, the beds to fit just perfectly. We want the clothes. We love comfort, and we even worship comfort. We go to churches where we feel comfortable. We go to churches where they don't do anything outside the realm because they that would make us uncomfortable. Um, and so we love it. And I think it's just one of the things that Jesus so excelled at is that he was able to make the comfortable uncomfortable. He was able to get to the real heart of the matter for people, and he would attack the things that made us comfortable, and he would drag us into the uncomfortable. He would do things that would make you have to respond. He healed people on the Sabbath. He healed people on the Sabbath because he knew that it would make people begin to question what they believed. And then I think so much of our lives, God invites us into those type of situations. And I think that we don't always respond because we are afraid to move outside of that comfort. And so we don't. So we don't always say, okay, sure, Jesus, I'm going to follow you wherever you lead, I'm going to go. I've decided to follow Jesus. My cross before me, the world behind me. And yet, when it really comes down to it, is that how we live? And then I think that if we want to get just super uncomfortable, I think then as a church, as a culture, we have to address the things that we've just not gotten right. I mean, we have to address the fact that we tend to flock to leaders that are charismatic, but often are prideful and arrogant and abusive in a spiritual sense. Sometimes in a physical sense, sometimes in a sexual sense, and we have a history of making excuses and covering up for them and hiding their abuses and their mistakes, of not taking their sins serious, of not taking the idea of this the pride that they have, the arrogance that they have, and the destruction that brings. I mean, it shouldn't be surprising, right? We reap what we sow. And so when we flock to leaders who do that, when we don't have the courage to say that's not how people should be, that's not what you should do, that's not the heart, that's not how you treat people, because we say, oh, but look at the number of people that are attending church, look at the number of people that are being saved, and we go, oh well, God must be doing something, so I'm not going to say anything. When we fail to address the materialism in our church culture, when we fail to address the fact that we esteem those who are able to make money and large amounts of money, and that we aspire to be like those people, not because they're not always, sometimes because they're people of God character, but most of the time, not because they have godly character, but because they have stuff. We aspire to be like them. We want to be rich. We don't want to be rich in godliness. We want to be rich in money, because money brings us that comfort. Like we live in this society because money brings us that prestige. Because money is really where we find safety and comfort. And that's why I think, like, you look back at like COVID and all the craziness that went on, all the craziness. One of the things that really stuck out was the fact that the richest country, the richest people, could do nothing against the virus, and they had to sit at home. We had to shut down, regardless of the amount of money that we had, regardless of the amount of materials they had. And it was just so obvious that there was a plain lesson of God is the only one who's in control, no matter how much money you have. And the truth is that no matter how much money you have, you will find that you'll get sick and you will die, and you will not take it with you. There's no bank accounts in heaven about how much money you had on earth. There are bank accounts in heaven about what you did to the least of these, about what you did as you were serving Jesus, but there's nothing in there about what the amount of money that you had. And so I think that we fall too easily as a church into the trap of disliking other people's sin and calling out sins that really aren't in our culture, sins that don't really cost anything because they're not our people. They're not the things that our people do. And they're not the things that our church does. And yet, like the Beatitudes say, blessed are the brokenhearted. Blessed are the pure in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. And then Jesus goes on to say, you're trying to take a speck out of your brother's eye, but you have a plank. And I just think that the American church has a wealth problem because that is really what we worship. It's what we really esteem to. It's where we put our trust. We put in God our trust. In God we trust in our money, but really we trust in the amount that's in our bank accounts. And I think that you would see a mass exodus if a church was like, hey, I think we oughta sell everything we have and live in community. I mean, can you even just begin to hear like, oh, you guys want to be communist? Like you want to live in community? Nobody owns something? Like, that sounds like communism to me. And you go, oh, but what about Acts 4? Well, I don't know about that. And I'm not even really, but I think if you had a church, so not even trying to push that, but I want us to think about that. Like this week, I just want to think about the idea that if Jesus came to you and you said, Rabbi, teacher, you have the words of life. What must I do to inherit life? And Jesus said, go sell everything you have and then come follow me. How would you respond? And just like let it set in your heart. Go give up your degrees. Go give up your hard-earned job. Go give up the time that you've spent to get that level of respect and prestige. Throw it all away and come follow me. I think that it would be extremely difficult. And the reason I think that is because as a culture, I don't think we're fully convinced that what Jesus has is better. I think we're fully convinced that what Jesus has for death, what happens after we die, is better, but I don't think that we're fully convinced that what Jesus has for us in this life is better than what we can do for ourselves, than the money we can make, the houses we can buy, the cars that we can drive, the comfort that we can gain. I don't think that we're convinced that Jesus is just better. He's better because we're like, well, I don't want to go to hell. That seems like a very poor choice. And heaven seems nice. So I love what Jesus has for me after death. But I'm okay. I'm comfortable with what I have now. I'm good with the money that I have now, with the stuff that I have now, with the prestige that I have now, with the vacation and the friends and all of that comes, that whole package. The children that I could think of, the opportunities I provide for them. And Jesus said, yeah, those are good. Those are good. But I want you to give it all up. He came to you. He came to me and he goes, hey, you can't have two masters. You can either love God or you can love money, but you can't serve both. He doesn't say you can't have money. He says you can't love money. I think that our culture loves money. It's what we worship. And I'm very much afraid that our church has fallen into the similar pattern. So that's the challenge this week. To think about that question. If Jesus were to show up in your life somewhere, random coffee shop, at your work, and you were like, oh, you know all things. You know the answers. And he said, oh yeah, I know what you need to do. You need to get rid of the things that you've put, that you love more than me. And you're like, Jesus, what is that? And he goes, you just go and go sell all your possessions and then take that money and give it to the poor, the undeserving, the ones that didn't earn it. And you come follow me and you'll have full life. What would you say? That's what I'm going to do this week. I'm going to contemplate that, think about that. What is it that Jesus is calling? What is it that Jesus is saying? When we think about sin, we love to look at the outside world and be like, don't be like them. But do we just follow him? Are we different? Are we any different? Our divorce rates aren't different. Is our greed any different? Is our materialism any different? I mean, where do we draw the line? What is it that Jesus is calling you to do? And who is it that Jesus is calling you to be? That's the challenge. Think about that this week. Meditate on that. Ask God to reveal that to you. And may you find blessing in that as you struggle through those topics.